On a first-class flight from New York to Los Angeles, a black passenger boarded the plane with a modest appearance, lacking the typical grandeur expected of first-class travelers. But this very simplicity made him the target of disdain from a flight attendant. She not only insulted him, but even raised her hand to slap him in front of all the passengers, completely unaware that this man was, in fact, the owner of the airline. What do you think happened next? If you were a witness to this situation, what would you do? Share your thoughts in the comments below. At JFK International Airport in New York, on a seemingly ordinary morning, thousands of passengers hurriedly moved through the check-in counters. The loudspeaker announcements echoed across the expansive terminal. In the first-class section of SkyVista Airlines, passengers were pampered with gourmet meals and luxurious leather seats. But unbeknownst to anyone, today's flight, SVX 101, was about to become the epicenter of a shocking event that would change everyone's perspective. Ethan Johnson, a 30-something black man, walked calmly into the check-in area. He was tall, with bright eyes and a confident demeanor, but his attire was modest, a slightly worn black jacket and simple jeans. A brown leather backpack hung over his shoulder, far from the ostentatious style typical of first-class travelers. Ethan smiled slightly as he caught the curious glances of a few nearby passengers, but he paid them no mind. He was used to such stares. A successful entrepreneur, Ethan frequently traveled between major cities for business. However, he had always maintained a humble lifestyle, preferring simplicity over extravagance. Today's flight wasn't for work or a high-stakes negotiation, but for a significant family celebration, an event he couldn't afford to miss. After completing the check-in process, Ethan entered the first-class lounge. The other passengers, mostly white, seemed uncomfortable as he sat down on a nearby sofa. A middle-aged man even pulled his chair slightly farther away. Ethan remained unbothered, pulling out his phone to check his schedule. Minutes later, the announcement for flight SVX 101 began. Ethan lined up and made his way toward the boarding gate. At the cabin door, Clara Benson, the lead flight attendant, stood greeting passengers. Clara, a woman in her 40s with neatly styled blonde hair and a sharp expression, was well known for her professionalism and her arrogance. She had no reservations about showing her disdain for passengers she deemed unworthy of first-class service. As Ethan approached, Clara eyed him from head to toe with an air of skepticism. Unlike the warm greetings she offered to the passengers before him, Clara gave him only a curt nod, not bothering to smile or speak. Ethan, unperturbed, handed over his ticket for inspection. Clara glanced at the ticket, then at Ethan's name, and looked up again. "Are you sure this is your ticket?" "I think economy class is in the back," Clara said with a tone full of insinuation. Ethan raised an eyebrow and calmly responded, "My ticket is perfectly valid. I suggest you double-check before jumping to conclusions." Clara scoffed, handed the ticket back, and replied coldly, "Fine, take your seat. But if there's any issue, I'll have you moved immediately." Ethan didn't say another word. He stepped past Clara and made his way to his seat. It was 1A, a window seat where he could relax throughout the long flight. As Ethan settled in, the surrounding passengers continued to cast glances his way, some curious, others cautious. He sighed softly, trying to brush off the discomfort. He had long since learned to maintain his composure in the face of such discriminatory stares. Clara, meanwhile, returned to the cabin and resumed her duties. She chatted cheerfully with the other passengers, but kept a close eye on Ethan. To her, he was a misfit in the first-class cabin. She neither knew nor cared who he really was. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Clara walked through the cabin, checking passengers' seat belts. When she reached Ethan's seat, her tone turned curt and dismissive. "Next time, make sure you're in the right section. First class isn't for just anyone," she said. Ethan looked up at her, his gaze cold yet commanding. He replied succinctly, "I know exactly where I belong. The question is, do you?" Ethan's response left Clara momentarily flustered, but she quickly recovered, maintaining an outward appearance of calm. However, inside, her irritation was mounting. She silently resolved to deal with this young man if the opportunity arose during the flight. The plane took off, but the tension between Ethan and Clara had only just begun. The plane slowly lifted off the runway, soaring into New York's blue skies, leaving behind the towering skyscrapers and the city's hustle and bustle. In the first class cabin, a quiet stillness settled as passengers began to relax. Yet, in one small corner of the cabin, tension was simmering beneath the surface. Ethan Johnson sat comfortably in seat 1A, his gaze fixed on the large window. Outside, white clouds drifted lazily, as if mocking the subtle unrest brewing within the cabin. He was fully aware that he was the focus of several unkind glances from other passengers and, most notably, from Clara Benson. Despite this, Ethan maintained his usual calm demeanor. He had spent a lifetime learning to navigate moments like this with poise. Not long after the plane reached cruising altitude, Clara began serving drinks to the first-class passengers. She pushed a cart filled with fine wines, fresh juices, and expertly mixed cocktails. When she reached Ethan's seat, she stopped, her expression betraying her irritation. "What would you like to drink?" Clara asked, her tone devoid of warmth or politeness. Ethan looked up, his voice calm and polite. "I'd like an orange juice, please." Clara hesitated for a few seconds, as if debating whether he deserved to be served. Finally, she poured a glass of orange juice, but instead of handing it to him like she did with other passengers, she slammed it onto the tray table in front of him. The juice sloshed close to the rim, nearly spilling over. "There," she said curtly, without a hint of a smile. Ethan glanced at her, his sharp eyes conveying more than his words ever could. He picked up the glass, his voice steady as he said, "Thank you." Though polite, his words felt like a challenge to Clara, igniting her frustration further. Other passengers began to notice the interaction, but no one dared to intervene. They whispered among themselves, their eyes darting between Ethan and Clara. A few smirked, clearly pleased to see Ethan being treated this way. In their minds, he didn't belong here, and Clara was simply doing the right thing. A short while later, Ethan pressed the call button for the flight attendant. Clara, who was standing at the back of the cabin, saw the light above his seat illuminate. With a slow, deliberate pace, she walked toward him, her face etched with annoyance. "What is it now?" she asked, her tone dripping with impatience. Ethan remained composed as he responded, "I'm sorry, but my orange juice is about to spill. Could you please bring me another glass, and this time, I'd appreciate it if you set it down a little more carefully." Clara froze, feeling as though she'd been insulted. She couldn't believe that Ethan, a man she deemed unworthy of first class, had the audacity to make such a request. "Listen," Clara said, leaning down so only he could hear, "I don't know how you managed to get a first-class ticket, but I'm not here to cater to you. If you want better service, I suggest you buy an economy ticket next time." Ethan stared at her silently for a few moments, as if weighing his options. Then, he gave her a faint smile, though it carried none of the warmth one might expect. "Thank you for your advice," Ethan said in a steady voice. "But I believe the service here is meant to treat all passengers equally, regardless of how they look." Clara wanted to retort, but Ethan's words left her without a valid argument. Frustrated and feeling humiliated by someone she considered undeserving of her respect, she turned away and resumed her duties, though anger simmered within her. A short while later, Clara returned to the first-class cabin with the meal service cart. When she reached Ethan's seat, she glanced at the menu list and spoke louder than necessary, her voice carrying an air of mockery. "What would you like? We have American steak, grilled salmon, or a Mediterranean salad, but I'm not sure which one suits you best." Her remark drew a few snickers from nearby passengers. Ethan raised an eyebrow, clearly catching the condescending undertone in her words. However, instead of reacting with anger, he calmly replied, "I'll have the steak, thank you." Clara nodded, but rather than noting his choice, she deliberately ignored him and continued serving the other passengers. When Ethan realized that his meal had been forgotten nearly 20 minutes later, he pressed the call button for the flight attendant once again. Clara approached with a cold expression. "What is it now?" she asked, her tone laced with impatience. Ethan, still composed but firm, responded, "I think you forgot my meal." "Oh, I thought you weren't hungry," Clara said sarcastically, "but fine, I'll check on it." She walked away at a leisurely pace, showing no urgency to resolve the situation. Ethan remained seated, unfazed by the blatant disrespect. Around him, a few passengers exchanged pitying looks, and a woman nearby whispered, "It's awful someone like him is sitting here. I bet he had to borrow money just to get the ticket." Ethan heard her comment but chose not to respond. He understood that silence often carried more weight than words. The tension between Ethan and Clara continued to grow, but Ethan knew better than to escalate the matter. Instead, he observed quietly, waiting for the right moment to act. Because on this plane, only one person knew the truth. Ethan was no ordinary passenger, and this flight was not just a journey for him. It was a test for everyone around him. The plane continued its journey, but the atmosphere in the first class cabin grew increasingly tense. Clara Benson, with her characteristic arrogance, could no longer contain her frustration. She felt that Ethan, with his modest appearance and calm demeanor, was deliberately challenging her authority as a flight attendant with 15 years of experience. About 3 hours into the flight, Clara returned to the cabin with a cart of desserts. Some passengers were reading books, others were watching movies, and a few were asleep. As Clara approached Ethan, she stopped and looked down at him with a cold, piercing gaze. "What would you like for dessert?" "We have cheesecake, tiramisu, and fresh fruit," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Ethan looked up from the book he was reading. "I'll have the tiramisu, thank you," he replied evenly. Clara nodded, but as she reached for the dessert from the tray, she intentionally dropped the fork onto Ethan's seat. She feigned surprise, covering her mouth with her hand. "Oh, I'm so sorry. I must be a bit clumsy, but I'm sure you don't mind cleaning that up, do you?" Several passengers nearby chuckled at the scene. Ethan calmly grabbed a napkin, cleaned the mess from his seat, and then looked directly at Clara. He said nothing, but the intensity of his gaze conveyed more than words ever could. It was enough for Clara to feel the weight of his disdain. But Clara wasn't finished. She straightened up and, in a voice loud enough for others to hear, remarked, "You seem very comfortable here, but I can't help wondering, do you really belong in this cabin?" Clara's comment was like a punch to Ethan's dignity. All eyes in the first-class cabin turned toward him, some filled with curiosity, others tinged with disdain. An older man sitting nearby leaned over to his companion and whispered, "How ridiculous! What's someone like him doing here anyway?" Ethan remained silent. He wasn't the kind of man to lose his temper over petty provocations, but his silence only seemed to embolden Clara, making her feel even more challenged. She resolved to push things further, determined to assert her control. A short while later, Clara returned to Ethan's seat, this time without a tray of food or drinks. She stood in front of him, hands on her hips, her voice sharp and confrontational. "Listen, I've had enough of this. I don't know where you got this first-class ticket, but I'm certain it's not legitimate. You should admit it now so I don't have to call the captain." Ethan looked up at her, his eyes cold and piercing. "As I've said before, my ticket is completely valid. If you have doubts, feel free to check the passenger manifest." "Check?" Clara let out a bitter laugh. "Do you think I don't know what someone like you would do to get a ticket like this?" Her words sent a ripple of tension through the cabin. A few passengers began exchanging looks of disbelief. A young woman sitting nearby murmured softly, "Maybe we shouldn't judge others so quickly." But Clara, blinded by anger and prejudice, ignored the comment. She leaned closer, pointing a finger directly at Ethan, her voice dripping with provocation. "If you don't leave this seat immediately, I'll have no choice but to call the captain. We do not tolerate fraudulent passengers here." Ethan remained seated, his calm composure unwavering. Slowly, he stood up, forcing Clara to step back. His gaze locked onto hers, firm and unyielding, his voice low but commanding. "I'm not going anywhere, and I suggest you be very careful with the way you're speaking to me." Ethan's warning only seemed to fuel Clara's rage. She couldn't stand being defied in front of everyone. In a moment of uncontrolled anger, she raised her hand and slapped Ethan hard across the face. The entire first-class cabin froze. No one moved, no one spoke. The only sound was the sharp echo of the slap, reverberating through the silence. Shock and disbelief were etched on every passenger's face. Ethan raised his hand to his cheek, which was still stinging from the unexpected blow. He didn't yell, didn't retaliate, didn't even look angry. Instead, he calmly bent down, picked up his backpack, and looked Clara directly in the eye. His voice was low, steady, and filled with an ominous weight. "You just made a very big mistake." The first-class cabin was engulfed in a tense silence. After Clara's slap, everyone held their breath. Some passengers were still in shock, unable to believe what had just happened. All eyes were fixed on Ethan, who remained standing, calm and composed in a way that defied understanding. No one could have predicted that this moment would completely change the course of the story. Ethan gently set his backpack down on the seat, showing no sign of anger or loss of control. He turned to face Clara, his gaze cold yet commanding. "Are you absolutely sure about what you just did?" Ethan asked, his voice low but resonant. Clara froze for a few seconds as if realizing something, but her pride wouldn't let her back down. "I didn't do anything wrong," she said, though her voice was beginning to tremble. "You're causing trouble, and I'm just doing my job." "Your job?" Ethan repeated, emphasizing each word. "Is this how you treat passengers, or just the ones you think aren't worth respecting?" Clara felt her breath catch at his question. She stammered, unable to find the right response, but she forced herself to maintain a firm stance. "If you keep this up, I'll call the captain and have you removed from the plane immediately," she said, raising her voice to mask the unease growing inside her. Ethan gave a slight nod, as if he had been waiting for this. He reached into the pocket of his jacket, pulled out his phone, and pressed a few buttons before holding it to his ear. The first-class cabin fell silent, every passenger straining to hear his call. "Hello, this is Ethan Johnson," he said, his tone calm but authoritative. "I'm on flight SVX 101 with Sky Vista Airlines, and I need to speak with the captain or the highest-ranking crew member on board right now." Less than a minute later, the flight captain, a middle-aged man with a stern demeanor, emerged from the cockpit. He quickly made his way to the first-class cabin, his sharp gaze scanning Clara before settling on Ethan. "Mr. Johnson, I'm Captain William Harper. I've been informed that there's an issue here," Captain Harper said, his deep, steady voice carrying a tone of clear respect toward Ethan. Clara, standing just beside him, was stunned to hear the captain address Ethan by his last name, with such an unmistakably different attitude. Confusion and disbelief were written all over her face. "Captain, I believe he's causing trouble. He doesn't belong in this cabin and refused to leave when I asked him to," Clara said quickly, scrambling to explain herself. Ethan glanced at Clara, then turned back to Captain Harper. "Before you draw any conclusions, I think you should know exactly who I am," he said, pulling a card from his wallet and handing it to the captain. Harper took the card and studied it for a few seconds before his face turned pale. On the card, bold letters read, "Ethan Johnson, Chairman of the Board, Sky Vista Airlines." Harper's eyes widened as he looked up at Ethan, now filled with astonishment. "Mr. Johnson, I sincerely apologize for any inconvenience you've experienced," Harper said, bowing his head slightly in a gesture of respect. Clara's face turned ashen as the realization hit her. She stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to form words. He's the chairman? That's impossible," she stammered. Ethan turned his cold gaze to Clara. "What did you just say? That I don't belong in this cabin? That my ticket isn't valid?" He paused, his voice sharpening. "Do you even realize what you've just done?" Clara couldn't respond. She lowered her head, her hands trembling. Around them, the murmurs of other passengers grew louder. A few shook their heads in disapproval. An older man nearby muttered under his breath, "I think we've all judged him completely wrong." Ethan took a deep breath, making a conscious effort to maintain his composure. "Captain Harper, I request that you document everything that has just occurred. Ms. Benson here has not only insulted me, but also resorted to violence, an action that is unacceptable under any circumstances." Harper nodded firmly, his tone serious. "Understood, Mr. Johnson. I will immediately report this incident to higher management and ensure that Ms. Benson is held accountable for her actions." Clara began to stammer, her voice trembling. "Mr. Johnson, I'm sorry. I didn't know who you were. I didn't mean to offend you." Ethan cut her off, his voice calm but firm. "You don't need to know who I am to treat me with respect. The problem lies in your belief that you have the right to judge and insult others based solely on their appearance." Clara lowered her head, unable to muster any further response. Ethan turned to the surrounding passengers, his voice gentle yet commanding. "I hope this serves as a lesson for all of us. Success or status should never be the basis for judging a person. What matters most is how we treat one another, with kindness and respect, regardless of who they are." The first-class cabin fell into a heavy silence. Passengers who had once looked at Ethan with disdain now felt the sting of regret. A few nodded quietly, acknowledging the truth in his words. Captain Harper bowed his head once more. Mr. Johnson, I will personally ensure that this incident is not repeated. If there's anything else you need, please don't hesitate to let me know. Ethan offered a faint smile. Thank you, Captain. I think all I need now is a peaceful flight for the remainder of this journey. When the plane landed at LAX International Airport in Los Angeles, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin remained heavy. No one dared to meet Ethan Johnson's gaze. The man they had once looked down on, now revealed to be the owner of Sky Vista Airlines. Their actions and attitudes throughout the flight had turned into a source of deep regret. Clara Benson, the lead flight attendant, stepped out of the cabin with a pale face. Her usual arrogance was gone. She knew that her 15-year career could come to an end because of her impulsiveness and prejudice in just a few short hours. But more than that, what truly unsettled her was the calm yet commanding look in Ethan's eyes, a look that made her realize no one has the right to judge others based solely on appearances. After disembarking, Ethan was escorted to Sky Vista Airlines Executive Lounge at LAX to rest. This luxurious area was typically reserved for only the most important passengers. Several senior executives from Sky Vista, who had been alerted to the incident, arrived promptly to address the situation. Clara was also summoned to the executive lounge, not for any privileges, but to account for her actions. When she entered, she saw Ethan sitting comfortably in a large armchair, his eyes focused on a report in his hands. Beside him were Captain William Harper and two senior managers from the airline. Ms. Benson, one of the managers began, his tone firm, we've received reports from Captain Harper and Mr. Johnson about what happened on flight SVX 101. Do you have anything to say before we make our decision? Clara swallowed hard, her trembling hands clasped tightly together. I sincerely apologize, she said, her voice shrinking with each word. I didn't know Mr. Johnson was the owner of the airline. If I had known, I would never have behaved that way. Ethan raised an eyebrow, interrupting her. You shouldn't have to know who I am to behave appropriately, he said, his voice calm but resolute. Respect should not depend on someone's title or status. The sad truth is that during this flight, you chose to let your prejudice dictate your actions instead of doing your job as a professional flight attendant. Clara lowered her head, unable to respond. Ethan turned to the managers and Captain Harper. I'm not here to humiliate anyone, he said. But it's clear that Ms. Benson's actions have not only harmed me personally, but have also tarnished the reputation of this airline. I need assurance that this will not happen again. One of the managers nodded. We understand, Mr. Johnson. Ms. Benson will be suspended immediately while we conduct a thorough investigation. We will also implement additional training for our staff to prevent similar incidents in the future. Ethan offered a faint smile. I want to emphasize that this is not just a personal issue. Sky Vista Airlines is not merely an airline. It's a brand that stands for professionalism and fairness. I hope every one of our employees understands that respect should be extended to all people, regardless of their race, nationality, or appearance. Tears began streaming down Clara's face as she broke into sobs. I'm sorry, Mr. Johnson, she said. I truly apologize for the way I treated you. I was wrong. Ethan regarded her for a moment, his expression calm and steady. I hope you've learned something from this, not just for your job, but for the way you live and treat others. Mistakes can be corrected, but only if you're truly willing to change. Following the meeting, Ethan requested that a formal message be sent to all Sky Vista Airlines employees. The message highlighted the importance of respecting and serving customers fairly, regardless of their circumstances or status. On social media, the story began to spread as passengers from the flight shared their experiences. They recounted how Ethan Johnson, despite being disrespected, maintained his composure and grace, delivering a powerful lesson for everyone. The story quickly went viral, garnering millions of shares and comments from around the globe. One passenger wrote, I used to think success always came with an extravagant appearance, but Ethan Johnson taught me an important lesson. What truly defines a person's worth isn't their outward appearance, but how they treat those around them. After being suspended, Clara spent time reflecting on her actions. She realized that her arrogance and prejudice had clouded her judgment, leading her to make an unforgivable mistake. One day, she wrote a handwritten letter to Ethan's office. In the letter, she expressed her deep regret and gratitude for the way he had handled the situation with dignity, rather than harsh criticism. She wrote, "Mr. Johnson, I'm sorry for what happened. You've taught me that respect is something money cannot buy. I promise I will never repeat this mistake again." When Ethan read the letter, he smiled softly. He understood that no one is perfect, but opportunities for change are always available to those who are willing to acknowledge their faults. Ethan continued his work, tirelessly striving to build SkyVista Airlines into not just a renowned airline for its service, but also a brand rooted in human values. He believed this incident was not merely a personal experience, but a reminder for everyone of the importance of fairness and kindness in the way we treat one another. Finally, the story closes with the image of Ethan standing by the window of his office, his gaze fixed on the vast blue sky. He smiled, reflecting on his journey, not just the flight, but the greater journey of changing how people perceive and treat one another. The story of Ethan Johnson is not just a lesson for Clara Benson, but a reminder for all of us. Never judge a person by their appearance. Respect should be extended to everyone, regardless of their status, race, or outward appearance. What do you think about Ethan's actions? Do you agree with how he handled the situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. If you found this story meaningful and inspiring, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more amazing stories. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.